Normalizing dialect. As a country, the U.S. is becoming more and more aware of diversity issues. As an historical melting pot, the U.S. has an incredible number of languages spoken by citizens, many of whom have lived in this country for more than a single generation. Spanish in particular is always available in official documents in areas with high Hispanic populations. However, despite increasing respect for different languages, there is often little respect for, or even recognition of, different dialects of English. Here are two examples. Alim and Smitherson discuss former President Barack Obama's use of different types of English in a 2012 edition of the New York Times. They state, Mr. Obama's ability to bring together white syntax with black style played a crucial role in establishing his identity as both an American and a Christian. In addition, Obama was often observed shifting his speaking style depending on his audience, leading to articles like this that praise his linguistic flexibility, and also detractors who read his use of language as inauthentic or slightly patronizing. In contrast, there's Sherry, an African-American college student of Carmen Kynard, who produced very little writing, and what she did produce contained very short, choppy sentences that lacked clarity, fluidity, or complexity. This is not because Sherry was intrinsically bad at writing. In fact, Kynard believes that the problem was more complicated, stating, Sherry's hypercorrections of the surface features of writing and her insistence that this is dialect interference are, in fact, a product of language education. Kynard also noted evidence of Sherry's oral competence in her own dialect, saying it featured talk singing, repetition and alliterative wordplay, intonational contouring, and rhyme, all of which to me indicate an incredible mastery of English. So, the question is, why are students like Sherry, who share Obama's access to black style, consistently viewed as inferior language users? The problem comes down to what we, as a culture, believe to be good English, what Sherry called ethical English. Sherry's ethical English is just another dialect, albeit not the one she was raised using. Like many people, Sherry believed that mainstream American English, or MAE, was the correct and therefore better English. Linguistics, as a field, disagrees. According to Ferdinand de Saussure, an incredibly important thinker in early linguistic theory, language is an arbitrary system that is based on convention. He stated that a word actually has no natural connection with the signified. This means that no language is better than another language, since all languages are equally arbitrary. A cow is only a cow because we don't call it vaca. The other aspect of language he described that I would like to mention is that language is an overly complex system that is incredibly difficult, de Saussure would say impossible, to change intentionally. Fogel and Airy state, linguistic researchers long ago established that African American English, or AAE, represents a highly developed and structurally valid linguistic system that differs in many ways from standard English, but is in no way deficient to it, and proceeded to cite 6 studies from the late 60s and early 70s. Many articles that deal with AAE feel the same need to state that it is a legitimate dialect. There are many historical reasons that AAE has been disrespected and considered an inferior, incorrect form of expression, which there's no time to discuss here. Suffice to say that for almost 5 decades, experts have been writing about AAE as a legitimate, complex language that can communicate greater nuance in some types of communication than MAE, and most of the country hasn't heard anything about it. Despite being off the radar for most, AAE has been being studied in children, particularly relating to how it affects their education. Naturally, given the amount of historical friction surrounding use of AAE, not all of these studies have been entirely helpful. Stockman wrote an article entirely about the change in attitudes toward AAE in language studies. In earlier research, the research on African American children was not historically designed to answer basic questions about their typical language development. Instead, the focus was on if and how African American children differed from white middle-class children, who were considered the most normal children. This shifted to studying how and when African American children acquire language skills, as well as studies on practical assessment and intervention for students who were failing to thrive. Overall, the literature shows that some AAE-speaking students decrease the amount they produce AAE features over the course of early elementary school. An inverse relationship between the amounts of AAE use and performance on a variety of language and literacy measures, and that students can adjust their dialect when prompted to do so. The key to fixing all of this, according to many researchers, is acquiring the skill of code switching, which is being able to switch between 2 or more languages or dialects depending on the situation. It doesn't seem that simple to me. Code switching, or as Young and Young Rivera call it, code meshing, sheds light on the simple truth that in our society, people from all ethnicities, social circles, and academic levels use multiple dialects and registers of English in one context. It is a skill every person should learn, though not all people have access to the same Englishes. But saying code switching is the answer is ignoring the problem, which Young and Young Rivera see as telling African American students to switch from one variety of English to another, which is really a type of racial microaggression. I tend to agree. For example, in a study by Craig, Zhang, Hansel, and Quinn, it is not clear whether precious educational resources should be spent on teaching African American students to dialect shift as part of reading instruction. This seems pretty absurd coming from a study that says that their model was successful in explaining 40% of the variance in reading scores between black and white students. Despite this unhelpful conclusion, the study also wrote that any negative relationship between a student's use of AAE and their reading achievement would derive from insufficient knowledge of MAE and an inability to dialect shift, and that it is advantageous to become bidialectal. They just don't think it's worth teaching, I guess. Other studies attempt to offer suggestions for helping students learn MAE. One study states it may be helpful for children to learn about differences between school talk and home talk prior to school entry, and suggests a short-term summer program for students entering kindergarten. Another says it is heartening to know that the language skills in question are malleable among young children if they are provided with appropriate instruction. Young and Young Rivera believe that teaching code meshing is important, but also that every teacher must not only acknowledge the unfair practices that stem from socially stratified dialects and dialect discrimination, but must also act in our classrooms towards eradicating not dialects, but prejudicial practices and pedagogies. Fogel and Airy's study found that even introducing teachers to a few short texts in AAE one time improved the teacher's understanding of and attitudes towards AAE in a statistically significant manner. Giving instruction in addition to exposure led to even greater changes. They conclude their study stating, "It is noteworthy that effective instruction can be accomplished in a relatively short period of time and enhances not only teacher understanding, but attitudes." While much of this information may seem disheartening, it all points to change in the future. Alessandra Tennessini, a philosopher, believes that language is part of epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, and that when we use language, we are participating in the process that creates new norms. While de Cesar might disagree, I believe that Fogel and Airy's study, the only one I used that studied white people, shows that intentional use of language and exposure to language can change attitudes. If we can change attitudes by simple exposure, the next step should be to expose as many people as possible to what these studies claim to be simple truth. African American English is a real dialect that is just as legitimate and good as mainstream American English.